Should've known better, and I can't feel no remorse, and you don't feel nothing back.
You're doing a little air piano
I
just
always
now.
do the air piano. I skipped it last time, actually, so I don't always do it. I'm 3 for 4.
I was trying to tone it down this time instead of getting a little
What is
silly.
this show called?
What is this
And
show
who are you?
called? Where am I? Are we going to talk about frogs today? Or no, it was turtles.
We did turtles last time.
We did.
Oh, missed that one.
The meditating turtle out back. Yes.
Yeah.
Aaron's friend. So, welcome to Chronicles of Hope. I'm Emily Gray, and this is Aaron Kucharski. Say
Hello,
hi,
everyone.
Aaron. Today we have our very special guest, Brooke Feldman, is here with us, and also Sterling Johnson is hanging in the studio today. And we have some pretty,
All the way from Philly.
yeah. Did you guys like hop on an airplane to get over here?
Yeah, I wish. It was a helicopter.
Oh, okay. Well, that's even better.
Yeah, the helicopter pad on top of the haunted church that we're sitting in.
Let's just talk
is what
about-
we
were
this is
teasing
live from the
Brooke.
haunted church.
We were teasing Brooke a little bit about that this church might be haunted, and then Art came in and told
Might
us it
be.
really is.
It
Yeah,
is. It
yeah.
is. There's no
So
doubt.
if you hear us cut out,
Right.
send help.
It's getting late.
Yeah.
or if you hear like some weird
Somebody help.
voices in the background, then call for help.
Yes.
Right. So
Who do you call? Is it Ghostbusters when that happens?
Ghostbusters.
Actually, she's a little knitter down here. You'll just find yourself wearing a new hat or
Who's the ghost that you saw here?
the lady knitting.
downstairs on the first floor,
A
just
wo-
on the
woman
other side of
knitting.
the wall from the church.
You saw her with your own eyes,
Yeah,
and you were not under the influence of anything.
no.
I don't believe you. Had you had enough sleep the night before?
I did. Actually, I wasn't the first one to see it.
Oh
I definitely believe you are. There's no doubt in my mind that I before you even told that story, I said to somebody before I got here that I was going to a haunted
I'll
church.
introduce you to
Yeah.
the pastor.
You
man.
could feel it. You could.
He'll tell you that the parking lot is built on a graveyard.
Yeah.
That they didn't even move the bodies. They just
Yeah.
You're sweating right now,
that's
aren't you,
what it
Brooke?
feels-
That's the
what it
stuff
My
of-
feels like.
helicopter is parked
Right.
on that
that's
graveyard.
the stuff of Stephen King.
Oh my
I
God.
love it.
Well, of all days to have that revelation, Brooke did inform us that she's very uncomfortable with paranormal activity too. So anyway, thank you for coming. Thank you guys for taking the ride out here. Let's start by learning a little bit about Brooke before addiction, before any of this recovery, anything came about for you.
Sure. So I was born on April 28th, 1981.
we're
I'm
going
just-
all the way back.
Just messing with them. Yeah.
I'm an 81er.
Oh, nice. Yes. So no, I grew up really hearing about addiction a lot. My mother struggled with mental health challenges and addiction, and I did not see her since the age of 4. And I very much learned from my family and from the way people talked about my mom this idea that addiction was a choice and that my mom was choosing to use drugs over being a mom, that she was irresponsible, that she should stop choosing to use drugs and get it together and kind of show up and be a mom. And then I also grew up in the 80s, so maybe my birth date is important for this interview.
Right.
And the 80s was sort of the era of just say no, and the commercials where it's this is your brain on drugs and the fried egg. And so not only in my family but also in the world around me, I was being taught that you should just say no to drugs. That is as simple as that.
That easy.
Just say
Right.
no. And as a child, I wonder why my mom wasn't saying no. Why my mom was choosing to use drugs over being a mom. And I had a very difficult relationship with my stepmom and just kind of was like waiting for my mom to stop choosing to use drugs and to come back. And like, I thought my life would magically get better if my mom just showed up and kind of rescued me. And she didn't come back. And, around age 13, I kind of realized that I need to stop waiting for her to come back and instead go to her. And so I ran away from home one night. And I always say that my experience as a teenager of running away from home is like running 3 blocks away to my friend's house.
Right.
and then wondering how my parents found me. Like, how'd you know I was here?
Yeah.
And so I don't even remember what the argument was that I had with my stepmom that night. I grew up being very unhappy, though. I just very much didn't feel like I belonged, with my family, and very much felt like unloved, that if my mom loved me enough, then she would, stop choosing to use drugs, as I was told. And so I ran away, and instead of asking my father where my mom was, I kind of, in my 13-year-old little Brooke way, demanded that he tell me where she is. And I figured that if she knew that I still loved her and I forgave her and that I needed her, then that would be enough for her to stop choosing to use drugs. And so my dad, when I asked where my mom was and, demanded that he give me her address, he pulled over, and we were in this like brown beat up Astro minivan, which I think most kids in the 80s might have had an experience in. He pulled over, and I knew right away that like something was wrong. And he turned around and he said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your mom died last year." And so, in the last show with Sterling, I know the idea of trauma came up.
Yeah.
And at 13, I didn't have that language or that concept of trauma. And it probably wasn't until 2 years into my own recovery process that I could really define that experience as traumatic. I remember I didn't even cry. I kind of just like something in me broke. And, for me, my hope for my life getting better just sort of shattered that night. And, I felt a lot of anger about not being told until a year later. And that caused all kinds of trust issues that I still spend $65 copays on working through, 20-something years later. And I'd already been using alcohol. And at that point, I just didn't care. Like, once I found out my mom was gone and that my life was not going to get better in my mind, I just didn't care. And I also really just wanted to die. And when I think of that, any 13-year-old having that feeling, now I'm 37 and 13 seems really, really young. But I just wanted to die. And I ended up in my first hospitalization at the age of 13, and that would become a cycle throughout my entire teenage years of, mental hospitalizations, residential treatment facilities, kind of go in, get medicated, never work on what, the challenges were, never work on this mixture of like just this broken sadness, but also this anger I had towards my mom. I would just get medicated, come out, start using again, stop taking the medications, go back in. And when I was 15 years old, I was tired of being in these institutions. For me, again, back to that idea of trauma, my experience, at least back then with institutions, was that they actually caused more harm than help, and that I would go in and actually get sicker rather than better.
Right.
And at 15, I just was tired of it, and I decided to run away again. And so my experience with running away is that it never turns out well. And I stole a staff member's car keys. I was not the kind of car thief that could hotwire a car. I needed actual keys to make it happen. But I decided to run away, and I had like a 10-minute escape into freedom before I wound up in the juvenile justice system. And I was charged with like grand theft auto and all the 800 other charges they throw at you that at 15 you can't understand why. I kind of laugh at how I argue with the judge when charged with grand theft auto and receiving stolen property of why should I be charged with receiving something I stole? Like, of course I received it. But that really landed me into, again, just another even more traumatic situation. And for me, my experience of the juvenile justice system in Philadelphia was just extraordinarily traumatic. And that's, I talk often about, my experience as a white girl in the juvenile justice system because the system was clearly not designed for people like me. And all of my peers there were of color. I was like the only white girl there. And even having privilege in that system, it just was a horrific experience. But because of that privilege, instead of being sent to boot camp like many of my peers were, and for like much lesser charges, things like fighting in school or, truancy, I was sent back to a residential treatment facility. And so when I got there, I decided, you know what, basically all the adults and the people with power in my life, all they want me to do is just comply. That they don't really care about how I'm feeling,
Right.
whether I'm sad, what's going on. They just want me to like sort of follow the rules and do what I'm supposed to do. And I just knew the game by that point. Yes, I'll take my medication. Yes, I'll go to school. No, I won't get high. No, I won't punch walls. And I really just kind of stuffed everything. And my goal wasn't to get better or to address why I was there to begin with. It was, I think, I was stipulated to 4 to 12 months. And my goal was like get out in 4 months.
Wow.
And so everything I did was with that goal of getting out. And I was able to. And I ended up going back to high school. And first I went to what they called a twilight program. My probation officer understandably didn't think it was a good idea for me to go back to school. And so I would go to this twilight program that was from like 3 to 6. And I always played sports. It was like I had two kind of identities, like Brooke that was really good at sports and like Brooke that knew where to get really good drugs.
Right.
And those two worlds were sort of separate.
One wins out eventually.
One does, yeah. And I could not play ball when high.
Right.
Yeah, it was ugly.
Practice interferes a lot with getting high.
It does, yeah.
It does.
And prior to this point, during my periods of being in school, I would show up to practice high, and my coach, she really tried to work with me. And looking back, she was one of the positive adults that were in my life. But for me, the positive adults were who I felt safe with, and they often got like the most help from me. But I would go to this twilight program, and I would see the softball team practicing across the field, and for me, I knew that like I belonged there, like I wanted to be there. And so I begged my probation officer and my parents, and I begged my coach to just give me another chance and let me come back and play sports. And they gave me another chance. And so my life, really is a series of second chances, I think. And they're second chances that I'm aware not everybody gets. And I just got them because of, I think, a lot of privileges I had. But I was able to go back to high school. I had to go to night school and regular school in order to graduate. We won the Public League Softball Championship that year, which is like one of my favorite memories. And by some miracle, I got a basketball scholarship. My troubled past was well known in my community. There were newspaper articles written about like, Brooke Feldman makes a comeback, or troubled
goodness.
kid, like, yeah.
You're the poster child.
Yeah, the newspaper articles that I've been in often have highlighted my, sort of darker days. But I got a basketball scholarship, and I had no idea. I call it the power of the cup. When I was on probation, I had to give a weekly urine drug screening. And so I really believed that I no longer wanted to use, and that like I just wanted to move on with my life, and I was going to go play ball and, all of that. But the moment I came off of probation, I decided to do what many of us can relate to, which is celebrate just one time. That was all it was going to be. And then, before the first semester of college ended, I was right back to where I'd been. I managed to find like the 4 people on campus who smoked PCP, which is certainly not a drug that mixes well with basketball practice.
Oh, no.
And, no,
Doesn't mix well with really
you're like
anything.
dribbling really slow. And I actually got sick.
Physics are just not working.
No, that doesn't work with anything.
No. And I remember, my coach kind of, made a couple comments, but then one practice I ended up getting sick. We were running suicides, and that will make me nearly throw up on a good day, but certainly not if I'm under the influence. And he said, I know you're using, you need to get together or you're off the team. And I was not offered any support. I wasn't offered any resources. I wasn't directed to go talk to somebody.
You're supposed to just to choose.
Yeah, just choose to stop using. Exactly. And I couldn't, and I knew I couldn't at that point. And so my solution was just to drop out and walked away from a full basketball scholarship. And that was around age 18, and from 18 to 24 was just like a downward spiral. And in the end, I was back at that feeling of not wanting to live anymore. And when I sought help for my suicidal thoughts, not for my substance use.
Right.
And I was so broken and beaten down that I was honest on the assessment paperwork. And like all those questions they ask, and many of us know those questions well, it was clear that I was struggling with a substance use disorder. And I was assigned a drug and alcohol therapist, and his name's Sean, and he comes up later in my recovery story. And he really just met me where I was at. I would show up high. I didn't want to talk about my substance use. I just thought I needed like lithium or something, and that
Just another drug.
Yeah, and Sean, he had one very good point. He didn't try to force me into treatment. He heard that I spent my entire teenage life trying to get out of those places, so to go back in voluntarily was not something I was willing to do. But his point was that if I start the medication and I'm using other substances, that the medication is probably not going to help. And since I was like a lay pharmacist in my mind, I was like, that makes sense. And I committed to stop
he's a
using.
smart man.
Yeah, he was really good. And I committed to stop using on this Thursday that I was supposed to start the medication. And I used to tell this story before recovery as like a sign from God that I was supposed to keep using. But I was walking down the street and I found a bag of Coke on the ground, which when I wanted to get high, I couldn't find
Would
anything.
never happen.
And that day I was with friends where, my life was always these different groups. I had my athlete friends, my using friends, and then I had friends where like alcohol and pills were okay, but like coke and like other drugs weren't. And so I was with that group of friends, and I knew they would be on to me if I kept going back and forth into the bathroom. So my solution was to just do it all, so that way, you know, they didn't catch me. And then I just was, you know, I was a wreck, and they were going to the mall, and I knew that because I was like not even blinking at that point that I should probably stay back. And I stayed back, and I was in a house where I knew there was a gun in the drop ceiling in the basement, and really, you know, kind of reached a point of just deciding to end my life. It wasn't even like thinking about it at that point. I just made that decision. And I just had this sort of visual of my friend's son, who was 4 or 5 at the time, coming back from the trip to the mall and seeing his Brookie laying in the basement dead. And for me, that was enough for me to realize I needed to kind of get it together and get help. And that was sort of what sent me off into the journey of recovery. I went and I showed up back at Sean's office, like in a snowstorm, and said, I'm ready.
Wow.
And that began my journey.
Wow.
That's it's interesting. I had during the last interview that we did with Derek Hale had come up where just this was 6 years into my recovery, but like it was the moment that I realized that I wanted recovery, where I was walking down a street, an abandoned street, and I decided to close my eyes, and it was really early in the morning, and I ended up kicking over a bottle where it was just like, it's interesting that like there's just like moments like that where you're just like, okay, this is supposed to, you know, like something's supposed to happen now, and it just goes. And
Yeah.
it's just I mean, it's really interesting. I mean,
That saying, like, moment of clarity makes a whole lot more sense when you think about things
Yeah.
like you can't describe it. You can't describe it. It's just you're in the moment where you're willing to see something and it happens.
well, you were
Like,
talking about that vision of that kid coming down.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
that's like it's just you never know, like what that is for somebody that's gonna have them take the extra step through a snowstorm to go find help with somebody who planted a seed in them at some point in their lives, you know?
I was once asked like what helped me kind of hang on, and for me it was always some form of human connection.
Yeah.
Whether you know it's a little boy who I just had this like special bond with, whether it was my best friend who'd be like, Brooke, I see you have so much potential. Like, what are you doing? You could be doing so much better. And even as an adolescent, my coach, or like that one mental health tech at the hospital who truly cared, and I felt like she heard and saw me. And for me, you know, the thing that saved my life more than anything probably is human connection. And, you know, and one beautiful part of my recovery, and only recently, I feel like maybe about a year ago, I got to talk to that little boy. And this is, you know, 13 years later, and I got to tell him that, you know, he saved my life that day, and he had no idea. And it was really a beautiful experience, I think, for both of us to be able to share that.
Yeah, there's these moments in recovery that like when you like exactly like that, where like that's what makes it worth it, right? Like there's just these little moments that pop up once in a while. You're like, oh, that's why I'm still doing this. But like it's just stuff like that where you have it, where there's no way you'd have it if you weren't in recovery.
Yeah.
You know.
it's
amazing.
It's funny because there've been like my journey has been pretty positive for the most part, but I would be lying if I said that I didn't have lows in my recovery. And it's funny because this isn't funny. It's funny to me, but not a lot of people. I didn't want to be a parent. And for whatever reason, the universe decided that I should be a parent. And it's such a blessing because there have been times where I wouldn't necessarily choose recovery for myself, but I would choose it for my daughter's mom. You know what I mean? And so like, and then coming, like I might be in a tough spot, and I might have had that experience where if I wasn't a parent, like maybe I wouldn't have pushed through or like tried so hard, or maybe I would have gave in or taken the easy way. And I didn't have the opportunity to because I was also this person's parent, you know, and then coming out of that and looking back and being like, wow, what a gift that was, because I almost threw my life away, you know, or could have gone that route.
I'm glad you're a parent too, even though your daughter put gum in my hair about 40 minutes ago.
I'm the parent of a very special little girl.
Well, I know for someone who's been, my experience of treatment, of the treatment system, and also recovery. I was in my first 12-step mutual aid meeting at the age of 13, and so one message I heard over and over and over again is that you have to want to do it for yourself. Like, you have to want it for you. You have to do it for you. And I internalized that. There's a lot that I internalized that I picked up when I was supposed to be getting help that actually turned out to be really harmful, and I've had to sort of discard. But, when we think about that, we're asking people who feel unloved, who feel unworthy, who just feel like there's nothing to hold on to want to do this, like one of the hardest things in life, right, for themselves. And it's just really unrealistic. And I know for me that there were many things that motivated me that were outside of myself, and that quite literally I wouldn't be alive, that I wanted to die. But if it wasn't for how that would harm other people, and the thought of that, I wouldn't be here. It was sort of, we often hear that like people don't care about others when they're in active addiction, but I cared, deep down I cared, and I had enough compassion to not leave behind that kind of harm on other people. And so my life and my recovery very much is as a result of not wanting to harm others. And I think that that's sort of this message that we would do well to kind of get rid of, because whatever starts you and motivates you, that should be fanned and celebrated.
Wow, that's really important point.
Yeah. I hear that so much, that like you have to want it for yourself. I say, well, not necessarily. Like it doesn't matter at first. The hope is that eventually it will resonate and that you will want to continue to choose it for you. But yeah,
and also that people that are experiencing addiction or like don't care for others, we've done outreach to people experiencing homelessness, and taking care of each other is a necessity, especially when you are experiencing having to get well each morning, like relying on others, sharing resources, like the sort of care that we see out there, people that are the most vulnerable, is just amazing. And I don't know, that's just really important.
It's funny. I was like, I was watching this film the other day. It was, I forget the name of it. You guys might have seen it. It was about this girl, her experience with a brother. Red Balloons, Six Balloons or something. It's on Netflix. You got to watch it. Six Balloons. And it's this girl's experience with her brother in addiction and in a relapse. And it was interesting because it showed a side of it where, you can see, like I know this part and this perspective, and you guys probably do too, where the person who is suffering with addiction, right, care a lot about other people, but just are not capable of showing it, right? And how the family or the loved ones are incapable of accepting that they're sick right now. Like they continue to keep holding these expectations. Well, he didn't show up when he was supposed to, and he couldn't just, do it for me, and he couldn't. And if you really take a look at it, like that's very selfish to like put these expectations of what a productive, well human being, how they should show up. And they're not well. So like, I think that's a big part of it too, is like sometimes we have to accept that like this person's actions has absolutely nothing to do with me and how much they care about me. They're just not capable. Even, I could be the most important thing in their life, but if they're not capable, they're not. So.
I think, I think of that often in terms of addressing barriers to accessing treatment and recovery. That I know at least in the Philadelphia system and also in systems I've worked with across the country, that people really have to be able to dig in and have a level of resilience that would be hard for me to have on my best day, to be able to just navigate being bounced around from person to person when they call or showing up to one place. And, for someone with an active substance use disorder, the part of the brain that's responsible for being able to help us weather all of that is the very part of the brain that is impacted by a substance use disorder. And so we're expecting people to do things that just are like literally nearly impossible for them to do, and then we blame them and tell them it's their fault when they haven't.
Why can't you just go get help, right? Because
Or-
it's really hard.
Or like I remember working in a situation where the population I was working with were court ordered, and they had no resources, and so they were expected to, because they were being sent to treatment, this outpatient setting, that they were supposed to stay clean. But the fact of the matter was they weren't getting very much treatment because it was a public funded program and you had nothing but like interns providing all the services. And then they don't have a way to make a living. They don't have the time to make a living because they have to be here and they have to be there and probation and this and this and that. And then they don't have a driver's license and they don't have an education and they don't have probably a place to live, you know. And then when they can't stay clean, you put them in jail and you take their kids away
Yeah.
and you
Right.
you know, all of these consequences. And it's like they were set up to fail from the beginning.
And it's their fault.
And it's their fault.
Right.
Yeah, like if you could just get it, you know.
Yeah, if you want it bad enough.
Yeah, if you
Yeah.
want it bad enough.
Yeah.
So let's get back to where now you found yourself at kind of that pivotal place. And so what does like early recovery look like for you?
Yeah, and I think an important part of that too is that when I sought help, it was available instantly. This was in 2005. And I wasn't told to come back tomorrow. Wasn't told I was on a waiting list. You know, when I knocked, the help was available. And so I wound up in a long-term residential program initially after kind of going through rehab. And I thought I was being punished. You know, I so internalized being away as punishment that I remember saying, like, I don't want long-term. Like, I thought I was being, like, you know, sentenced. And
Right.
and I had a really great counselor who was able to kind of break down that this was a blessing, you know, and to take it. But my experience, you know, I would love to say that I never used again, you know, that was the end of it for me. But I had learned in my adolescent treatment experience just to focus on compliance and looking like I am doing the right thing and being like a quote unquote good client. And you know, there's a funny thing when you're looking to trick other people that it's very easy to trick yourself. There's a word that I can't use probably on the radio or with a child in the room for that, but it begins with mind. That you mind blank yourself. And so I would like walk around with like my recovery literature and I was like the model client. But then on the side, I sort of got embroiled in like a Jerry Springer episode rehab romance situation and with two people at the same time.
Yeah, look at Sterling's face.
It's scandalous. It's
Yeah, oh
scandalous.
yeah.
I
That
love
treatment,
scandal.
that treatment program, now
Especially
has
in rehab.
cameras. Yeah, you haven't lived unless
Until-
you've had rehab romance. But I got caught, and my solution always was to run, and so I ran away, and I used. And for me, it was a very important experience because, you know, when I used, I was not able to get that same escape that I gotten before, and when, you know, at that point in my life, being away, when I came out, my friends were more than happy that I was back, you know, and looking to use and would give me all kinds of substances for free, and which is like the only time that ever happens, you know. And free substances. And no matter how much I used and what combinations, I couldn't get that escape. I knew that I would eventually be like aware that I made a bad decision, but I thought I could at least have like a buffer period.
Enjoy it for a little while.
Yeah, but I did not have any escape, and so it didn't take me long to realize I needed to get back into treatment. But by that point, I had really exhausted my public benefits. You know, as an adolescent, I was through the publicly funded treatment system, and then prior to that, I was in the publicly funded treatment system. And
Wait, you're telling me you had public coverage, you got into treatment immediately, and long term? Wow.
yeah,
Have you ever heard
2005.
anything?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard anything like
Yeah.
that? Oh my goodness. Okay, sorry.
But because I left against medical advice or AMA,
yeah.
I was told that my only option at that point was outpatient treatment and a recovery house. And I was given a list of recovery houses and kind of, you know, sent off with a good luck. And I just so happened to pick a recovery house. They were all in Kensington. And in Philadelphia, I was like, who goes to Kensington to find recovery? That's the neighborhood my mom used and died in. That's the neighborhood I used in. And but I was just so desperate that I knew I would die if I did not do something. And so I just happened to go to this one recovery house. And after an interview process, the woman, the director at the time said, you know, I'm sorry, we don't have any what they call self-referral beds or walk-in beds. And I must have looked just like devastated. And she said, you know, but I see something in you. Like I could tell, like there's something in you. Let me see if I can call in a favor. And she called the Office of Addiction Services, coincidentally, where I would go to work later on in my recovery.
Wow.
And she sort of vouched for me. She said, like, I could tell she wants it, you know, and there's something about her, like, you know, can I take her in? And they said yes. And that was the beginning of my recovery. And so for me, my recovery story includes having access to treatment when I sought it,
Like a ton
but
of
also,
chances.
second chances.
Yeah.
And somebody being willing to call in a favor because they saw something in me. And for many years, I used to think like, well, that's because they must have known how amazing I am inside. You know, that like,
I can totally relate to that. How funny is it?
Like that they saw my light, and she was right. You know, like I have done well since then. But since sort of increased awareness and education, all those things, I find myself really wondering that if I had looked different or if I had talked different, if I wasn't this like cute broken white girl, who showed up looking for treatment, if I had been a little bit more aggressive sounding, if my language was a little different, would she have been so willing to call in a favor after only talking to me for 30 minutes? And I don't know the answer to that, but I know that the way our society works is that the fact is it would have been less likely. And so for me, part of my recovery really has been, especially over the past several years, to really bring awareness to that wellness and recovery and a chance at life shouldn't hinge on having a favor called in for you or somebody
Right.
and it's not about luck or things like that. And so that's been a large part of my advocacy and recovery.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've always appreciated about you is that you've challenged like my old beliefs or challenged the activism in me, and even when you talk about what's happening on the federal level in advocacy, what's happening on the ground, like there's things that I've been advocating for years, and then like you totally give me a completely different view on that. And one of the things that for the NCADD advocacy program, we do monthly trainings and workshops, and I wanted to make sure that, and Sterling can probably chat about this too, because we invited both of you to come to talk about race and white privilege in the recovery community, and it's something that more, I know you've done a couple of those workshops since, and I read a lot of stuff that you do on Huffington Post in terms of challenging just what we're doing in our advocacy efforts, and we want to say we have this organized, growing advocacy. I mean, it is a growing advocacy community, but are some of the things that we're advocating for harmful? Like just like the same way that you were talking about, in the sense of some of the things that you heard in early recovery were harmful, even though they might have been well intended. Yeah. And Sterling talked about some of the there's legislation that we passed in New Jersey that at the time, like, oh, this is great, it's going to help so many people.
Right.
And I'm just like, the unintended consequences can sometimes cause more harm, like not even thinking
Right.
about
Some of
it.
the messaging too. Some of the things I hear people say that they say, advocates will say to try to like put some kind of point across, and really actually gives a different message to some of us. So
Can you talk about, when you're talking about addressing race issues and white privilege in the recovery community, what are you talking about?
So you definitely have to start off by saying that I was totally sort of what we call colorblind. Like I grew up believing that, we're all human beings, we're all one race, the human race. I don't see color, and for me, education was really the critical sort of, thing that happened in my life to open my eyes. And to backtrack, I shared that I walked away from a full basketball scholarship, and for several years of my recovery, I had a lot of shame about that. Like I had given up this like huge opportunity, and so I used to justify not going back to school with all these great reasons, like knowledge should be free. Like why should I pay for it? I can look this stuff up on the internet. It's all capitalism.
the education system.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But when I got down to it, and recovery has helped me at least to really be able to kind of get below the surface and look at like what's really going on. I saw it was shame, and so I was able to go back to school, and it was a long crawl. But in undergrad, I took a race relations course, and this was 3 to 4 years ago now. And my eyes were just open about systematic racism, about institutionalized racism. I was confronted and forced to challenge my own thinking around it. And my experience has been just like I could never use again and get that escape. Like once you sort of know better, you can't like turn that off. Or at least I can't. When it came to seeing racism and how that plays out in our society, once my eyes were opened, I look around at this world I had been a part of for years. I got involved in recovery advocacy in like 2007, and I just looked around and I was like, oh my God, it is very white centered. That we're not, that is racist in the sense of like really advocating for only things that will benefit white people, and I don't think intentionally, and so for me, if you would have told me prior to this awakening that I would speak out about white privilege and about sort of the whiteness of recovery advocacy, I didn't even see the whiteness before, and so
Right.
I try to come from a place of understanding that, and I have the privilege to do that because I'm white, and I'm aware of that. But I really come from a place of like,
I see it.
yeah,
Everybody not that is not what usually sees it is very very aware of it.
yeah. And I think for me, being sort of like if I had to pick a label, like a gender nonconforming female, that I experience challenges in a life that's very sort of gender normative. That boys wear blue, they wear hats, they have short hair. Girls wear pink, they have long hair, they wear dresses, and that's not who I am, and so I've experienced sort of this like not fitting in with the norms of the world, and I think that helped to crack my mind open sooner, probably. It's not the same experience as being a person of color in a very sort of, institutionalized racist world, but that helped me. And
But you've had an experience that you
Yeah.
could relate. Like I've considered, so I am a white female and I'm straight, and so it would appear that I can't identify with maybe a lot of that, but I grew up really poor, like the poorest kid in my whole town, and the most broken family in the whole town, and the only kid in the whole town that hadn't been baptized and wasn't a Catholic. So, and it was funny because I felt that, right? Like I was the kid who like couldn't afford to go on the class trips, or I didn't always have lunch money. And I didn't always have like food in the house and things like that. And so, and I also saw like, my mother, struggled with mental health. And so there was just there were so many things that I didn't have access to that the people around me did. And I noticed really early how much harder things were for me than it was for them. When it came time to like, do college applications, like I didn't have the $25 application fee to send in college applications. I didn't have the money to buy my cap and gown. I didn't have, and so like I had
you
that.
didn't have like an uncle or your
No.
dad or grandfather that had went there and went through the experience of it. that
Right,
was able to
right.
tell
Who
you
could
all
like
of it?
help,
Yeah.
like the even just like the guidance and the encouragement and the
Yeah.
support. And then on top of it, like the financial, I remember like going to a friend's house and it was her birthday and everyone was bringing presents, and I called her and I was like, I have no money, like I can't bring you. And I was a kid, and she was like, that's okay, just make me a birthday cake. And then I sat and cried in my kitchen because I didn't have the ingredients to make a birthday cake, and I didn't go to her birthday party, and like things like that. And so when I had a similar experience as Brooke, as being in college, right, and starting to study these things and being like, my mind was ready to like see that and accept it and see how people all over the world and specific communities like were experiencing it. So it's funny, like when you talk about your story, and I've seen kind of some of the things that you write and share about, it's like, it's almost like I felt like I was in class with you, because I was like kind of going through those same ahas like all the time, like and so for me it was really inspiring because I had fallen in love with social justice and in college, and when I'd returned to college, and it's my passion. It's something I want to ultimately do. And then I find myself in this recovery advocacy movement, and hey, look, like there's some people talking about like race and privilege and recovery advocacy. Like my worlds are colliding, and this is really amazing,
Yeah.
So it's been really inspiring to read some of the things that you write and listen to you as well, and having that training that we all did together not that long ago. So tell us a little bit more about, so you do write a little bit do some freelance writing.
I do, yeah, and I would just want to offer too.
Yeah.
One thing I realized is, back in 2007, I went to the Face and Voices of Recovery messaging training, and I was at the one that was filmed for like the DVD, and so that's where I met like people like Greg Williams and Tom Coderre, and sort of like I was too like wet behind the ears to like know. I think Greg was still getting started at the time, but there were some like giants in recovery advocacy there, and I didn't know who they were. I just was so amazed that someone paid for me to stay in a hotel in Washington, D.C., and that they trusted me in the
Wow,
hotel
yeah.
room. But, I went to that first training, and that's really where I understood that our stories do have power and that our voices have power. But one thing I just was not equipped to understand just yet is that, as a white female, right, even gender non-conforming lesbian, that I have the privilege of being open about my recovery in a way that that other people don't. And that, so we sort of had this movement rise of be out about your recovery. But I can be open about my recovery, and you can Google my name and see my whole history, that I was a car thief, that I, all these things. But it's a redemption story, that our society here in America sees as hero's redemption story. But the stigma and discrimination and the shame and the criminalization of black and brown drug users, that is not the same thing. And if I talk about being in recovery, it's sort of like a, way to pick yourself up by the bootstraps, good job. But if I was a person of color, I would not have the privilege in a lot of spaces to be open. And so I think that had a lot to do with how we sort of had this movement grow of white faces and voices of recovery. And I have written a lot about it. It's interesting, another experience of oppression and marginalization that I had at the airport led to the Huffington Post opportunity. I had submitted things so many times in the past, and Bill White has always been a hero of mine, and I've gotten to meet and work with him in the past, and I used to be I want to be like you when I grow up. But at the airport, I went through the airport security thing where you put your arms up like that, and I didn't know that there are gendered buttons on that machine, and that the TSA agent either hits male or female. And so they hit male because at a quick glance I can look male, and it just led to this whole experience where somehow the machine said I had a groin anomaly, which I felt sounded scary, and that I didn't know what's wrong. Did I get abducted by aliens, and they put something in there, and
Groin anomaly.
yeah, and so that was a little scary in itself. And then when you set off the machine at the airport, they have to test your hands for explosives, and for whatever reason, my hands tested positive for explosives. And I was panicked, I thought I was being set up. Your head just starts thinking of all kinds of things. But I had
worst
to.
case scenario.
It was I was did somebody set me up? And so I had to get a pretty invasive search by TSA agents in a private room. And after it happened, I Googled kind of first, what is a groin anomaly? Because I was really concerned about that.
I didn't know it checked for groin anomalies.
Yeah, so it does, if there's something in your groin area that doesn't quite match up, I guess, with what the male anatomy would, I don't know. But in researching it, I found that people who identify as transgender have horrific experiences flying through the airport because of these things, and that many won't fly, and that there is this huge advocacy effort to really get the TSA to recognize gender is on a spectrum, And so I decided to write about it on the plane flying to Texas for work, just as a way to process it. 'Cause I was I thought I was going to be taken by the Homeland Security Department and never seen from again. And then I felt
But they did let you
outraged.
on the plane.
They did let me on the plane, yeah. And I just felt outraged that, same thing like you, I'm a social justice advocate, expands beyond addiction recovery. And I was wow, this is 2000 whatever at the time, and, I can't believe this is happening. And so I wrote a blog on my personal page, and somehow an editor from the Huffington Post saw it on Twitter, and he asked if I would mind if they put it on Huffington Post. And before I answered, I'm would I mind? What do you, yes, I'm trying to get you all to publish my stuff. And so that led to an opportunity to become a contributor. And so it was a non-paid position. But for me, it really expanded the audience. People will click on Huffington Post more than they'll click on BrookeMFeldman.com.
Right.
Although you can visit BrookeMFeldman.com.
See, she just did the lean into the
This
microphone
was my
thing.
sexy microphone voice.
Is it your NPR voice?
Yeah.
Where you talk really slow and every word.
That's what it is.
sounds
It's
so
NPR.
important.
Yeah, I have a new career. But that really expanded my reach. And for me, one thing that I've always been passionate about is that my experience of the recovery journey has been that is about so much more than not using drugs, and that the wisdom that is sort of gained or discovered or rediscovered on the recovery journey is just good human being stuff. That I'll talk to my stepmom who's not in recovery, and it's a Dr. Phil Oprah special, and and so I've always been passionate about sharing, sort of the gifts and the wisdom of recovery. And Bill White talks a lot about the boon of the recovery journey or the hero's journey with the larger world. And so it was a great opportunity to do that. And then also to raise awareness about some of the things that I think our own little, bubble in the world, the recovery advocacy movement, could be doing a whole lot better with.
Yeah, that's it's great to hear
Like
that.
what?
Yeah, Aaron wants to know.
Well, we talked about kind of uncentering the movement, in whiteness, and I think, when I look at the harm reduction movement, this is where we start to see things like racial and economic justice front and center. And my vision is that there will be sort of a convergence of the two, and that there may be sort of, some things or some issues that are separate, right? Like for some people, the harm reduction community, abstinence is not the goal. And for me, at 6 months in recovery, if you would have thrown me with people where it was like totally cool to do drugs, I likely would have been like, all right, I'm good. And I would have been doing drugs with them. And for me personally, I just know that like abstinence is the best pathway at this point in my life and, for the foreseeable future. So there may be separate spaces that are needed, but at some point there needs to be a convergence because drug policy in America is really where sort of, it sort of is where everything is where everything begins and ends in terms of where funding goes, how policies made. And so that's one aspect of it.
It's so divided.
Yeah.
Don't you feel like it's there's some really far extremes. There's there's a very strong recovery community that is nothing but abstinence. And then there's the harm reduction and there's all this stuff in between. And it's like, depending on who's sitting at the table, like the policy could go one way or the other, depending on the advocate. So yeah, that's so true.
And what scares me is that the people with the most privilege and power are often in the recovery advocacy world. When we look at where a lot of sort of the national recovery advocacy, when you sort of follow the money trail of who is funding those efforts, which in turn are informing policy. We're looking at wealthier white Americans who, like me, probably have no idea that like racism is still a thing, that it didn't go away with Dr. King's, and so
can't see it. They can't see it.
And so, to me, it's really scary that we see like policy being formed. And I've had many people say, well, we have to like kind of capitalize on the opioid epidemic and this will help everybody. But history has shown us that when we really focus solutions, in a white-centered way, to expect that it's going to trickle down to the most oppressed and marginalized people doesn't work, and that we really have to flip that around and have the most oppressed and marginalized people centered.
Well, I was thinking about how now they're finding fentanyl and crack, right, and it's all coming up from Mexico, and so this concerns me. Is like we've had all of this opioid-specific funding and initiatives and all this help for people if they are specific opioid users.
Opiates.
It's only opiates or opioids, right? And so now it's kind of like almost set up so that there's going to be people who need help who are at a higher potential for dying.
Oh, yeah.
And there's nothing there for them because we've specified that this is for opiates only.
And I've seen that across the country. So for the past few years, I've worked as a consultant with different systems across the country who are looking to improve their systems for mental health and addiction treatment. And so across the country, since the 21st Century Cures Act was signed, and then since the state targeted response dollars came flowing from the federal government and every state got all this money to address only opioids. I've worked with communities where methamphetamine is the drug that is ravaging their community. Right. And I've worked with people who they have this funding that they can only use to address opioid use disorder who are like, Brooke, I can't find anybody.
Right.
Yeah.
They're like stretching. They're like, this guy said that he took Percocet 6 years ago for back surgery. Can I count him under STR? And it's like, for me, it has certainly been a source of frustration to see happen. And one thing I talk a lot about is that, a lot of this is based on like this false narrative. So for me, prescription opioids was what brought me down, right? But I used them illicitly. I used many other drugs before then. I used alcohol, marijuana, Xanax, PCP, cocaine, methamphetamine. I mean, there was like a long list. And most people I talk to, that's sort of their experience too. And it wasn't like I had some kind of athletic injury and the doctor prescribed them to me and I had no idea that they were addictive because Big Pharma lied and my doctor didn't care. I sought them illicitly to get high.
That's the narrative.
Yeah.
Now, right.
It's funny. I was listening to a seminar one time and they were talking about how everybody just wants an innocent addict. Like if there's a way that this person has become addicted and it wasn't their fault, then we can feel bad for them. And so it's funny because I see that a lot in the opioid specific stuff. It's like, well, they had an injury or an accident and it was the pills and, almost as if they're completely innocent and that's why they deserve to get this help. Whereas the rest of us who chose, right, we're back to that choice idea, who chose to use drugs illicitly, we don't deserve.
Right.
Right.
And if we are foolish enough to think that the compassion that is extended to primarily white Americans who were innocent victims of these prescription opioids, right? If we think that that's going to extend to the black or brown crack cocaine user, PCP use, it's just not, right?
Right.
And so we hear this saying, which I think people come from a place of thinking that this is being like anti-racist, I guess, where they say addiction can happen to anybody. Where that is probably one of the most racist things you can say, because it's kind of like saying like, oh wow, like addiction can happen to us too.
Right.
But that anybody, it seems like, you know, that there has to be this innocent sort of victim narrative attached to it. And so for me, the hyper focus on opioids and the policy that it is informing and the funding that it is creating, which is only growing by, you know, that is built on a lie, because we can't sort of face and own our truth.
Right.
There are some people where that narrative does hold true. But
not
the
It's certainly not the
majority-
majority.
Right.
It's certainly
No.
not the majority.
It's a story that people seek after to tell too. You know, like I run an advocacy program. It's like when I have media people, they're like, "Do you know somebody who started? Do you know? Do you know a family member that has somebody else in their family that started on opiates for like exactly how you just described? It's like that. That's the story that gets sought out and told, and people are happy to relay it too.
Yeah, and what's hard, you know, so it's harmful for a number of reasons. One, that we're not going to get at real solutions for addressing addiction if we're coming from this place of like sort of a myth and focusing on one drug. The second thing is that this is not going to extend to the people who've been most impacted by drug policy in America, which are people of color and who are still most impacted. And then the third thing is that people who take these medications legitimately for pain conditions and they've benefited from them, that those folks are being harmed, that they're being too quickly taken down or cut off their medications. There are increased rates of suicide. And so not only are we not getting at solutions for ourselves or for the most marginalized and oppressed people, which are people of color when it comes to drug policy, but then we're harming this whole other group of people. And my experience, to be really frank, is that I can't get the recovery advocacy community to care about that. And that has been, for someone who has grown up in this community, who, you know, just feels like this is like my people, it has been so heartbreaking to feel like that sometimes it's just ignorance of not knowing.
Right.
But there are people who know that this is happening, but because they are so focused on riding this wave of the opioid epidemic, that it's okay to harm a whole another group of people. Right. And I was thinking today
It
about
serves
how
a purpose for some people too.
Oh yeah,
Gives
yeah.
people jobs. The opioid epidemic gives people jobs.
And we talk about self-centeredness of addiction, right? Many pathways talk about this. And I just find our advocacy at this point as a whole to be really self-centered and just causing so much harm. And so that's been something I've tried to write about and speak out about, you know, often to either crickets or anger. But there are some people I feel like who are starting to see this and hopefully we can reverse this course.
I know for me, honestly, like I needed to hear it a couple times. I needed to I've even reread some of the articles that you've written because I'm just like, I know what she's saying is right.
She's got to be right.
I need to start over so I could get there because, you know, just
I might have missed something
well,
the
that's
first
the thing.
time.
It's like, you know, people have been advocating the art stories, that power stuff. We've been advocating the same way because that's how we were taught to do advocacy on a national level, you know, and so to have that changed or tweaked, like I did need to. I needed that to happen like over a period of time because I didn't get it right away, even though I knew that Brooke Feldman knows what you're talking about, like that, like
She knows
you
what
know
she's
what I mean, like
talking
that's
about.
where and there's people in the recovery advocacy movement that I have a lot of respect for, where it's like even if I don't understand what they're saying, I try to put myself in a position to realize what they're coming from, and the piece about really treating trauma and pain and correctly and versus addiction, two different things, and or dependence or however we call it, you know, it's like that was something that and even it's interesting, I moved to Jersey in 2010 and I started working for the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, and like it's not even really until recently, like over the past 2 years, I started thinking about the drug dependence part. You know,
Yeah.
before it's like it's not National Council on Alcoholism and Addiction. It's like the drug. You know, like, and I talked to my boss about that, like why that was made that way, and it didn't even register.
Yeah.
Before.
It
And that's the
didn't
thing, it's
even
like,
register
a
for
lot of
me. When he said that, I was like, oh wow, he's right.
Well,
I
it's
never
like,
thought of that.
there's just and that's the thing that I think for me, like, there's just I got caught up into, all of a sudden these elected officials
Right.
want to listen to advocates who must be doing a really good job, that I didn't like put it together with the opiate crisis. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't put it together with, you know, I thought it was like just because we were doing this really good job in advocacy and because of the opiate crisis, those other sort of components to it, like I never even stopped to like even think about that.
Yeah, and I think it's been a really good lesson just for myself too, as a person who's been advocating for things like prescribing guidelines and prescription drug monitoring programs.
Right.
These are all things that that were going forward, you know, and it was the Obama era, and it seemed like we were doing better. But we look at what the results are, and there seems to be a lot of pain that's come out of it, and especially cutting off chronic pain patients from their prescriptions they've had for decades. And the fact of the matter is that has caused many people to go to heroin or fentanyl as a substitute. So it's also a great learning experience for us for the kind of advocacy we need to do going forward, because the amount of people that have died from overdoses in this country has not gone down. It's actually increased, and we've actually put more people in danger from fentanyl overdoses. So.
Yeah. So, Brooke, what exciting things are you working on now? I know you're busy. You're up to stuff.
Yeah, I'm always.
Up to something.
I recently completed grad school, which was quite a run.
That's awesome.
And you know, to me, it's amazing. You know, like just an amazing sort of full circle experience. But I find myself in one of those periods of like great transition, and so. My recovery has been marked by sort of not staying in the same space, either mentally or even physically, for long, and so kind of in this period of like a lot of sort of realizations and awakenings. I've spent a career, you know, for the past decade focused on supporting recovery-oriented systems of care and helping to like improve service systems, and I find myself thinking about things in a whole new way, and so, you know, I'm kind of in one of those spaces where I am just doing the next right thing and following my spirit and seeing where it takes me. And my experience with that process has been that it is the opposite of logic and reason. I had a plan when I went to grad school.
Yep.
I was going to make really great money, like money I never would have imagined making, you know, years ago. But I just found that I am being called in a different direction. And so I'm sort of navigating through that, and will be as surprised as you will be in how that works out. I know I hope to do more writing, though, and hope to do more activism. One thing I've realized is that what we don't see happening, which was really instrumental in other social movements, is activism. You know, we're missing... We have advocates that are like, please give us what we need. We'll work with you. But we don't have people saying, give us what we need. We're demanding it.
Right.
And so I feel called for more of that. So, yeah, we'll see. Maybe check in a year and, you know, I might be tied up outside of City Hall.
Who knows what you'll be, where you'll be protesting in front of.
Yes.
Or so anyone who wants to follow that and keep an eye on what you're up to, how can we stay in touch?
Probably Twitter is the best way. So at Brooke M _Feldman. I did it with my hand, but no one can see that. So Twitter is probably the best way. And yeah.
Just to top that off, you mentioned William White a lot. So if you want to read more around William White, Bill White, it's williamwhitepapers.org, I think, or .com. It might. I'm not
.com, I think.
Okay. And it's just if that was the first time you heard recovery-oriented systems of care, and you want to read a paper on recovery-oriented systems of care, that's a fantastic resource to get started at.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank you, Brooke.
thanks
Thank
again
you.
for coming out and for
Thank
sharing
you,
your story
Shirley.
with us. And keep an eye out for us on social media. Check out our YouTube and listen every other Thursday night at cityofangelsradio.com.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Lovely girl, won't you stay? Won't you stay? Stay with me. All my life I was blind, now I see. Lovely girl, won't you stay? Won't you stay? Stay with me. All my life I was blind, now I see.